Be sure to go to flipsidegaming.com and use promo code 6 for 10% off on orders over $10. It's a good deal and helps with the show. As does going to the Grizzly Gentleman. Promo code 6, 10% off at checkout. What is up, Planeswalkers? Thyrix back with some more Death and Taxes. Today we're doing part 4 in the series. So the last episode, I thought for sure that I talked about Akiri as well as Linvala, but apparently I hadn't. So Akiri is actually quite interesting. Now, if we do end up going a road with even just some equipment, the reason Akiri is worth consideration at the very least is because she helps the Death and Taxes deck on two fronts. She helps by, one, allowing you to draw a card when you attack with an equipped creature, and two, allows you to utilize that equipment in a way that isn't just aggressive. It allows you to give you that creature indestructible, so that if you have, I mean, even if you just have like 2 equipment out, one attached to Akiri, one attached to someone like Thalia or something like that, holding up 2 mana to just unattach those equipment and give them indestructible is quite nice. You do have to tap those creatures, but oftentimes that's not going to matter too much. Linvala. I really thought I talked about this card. This is one of the greatest cards, and one of the best reasons to run the blue-white version. The reason for that is, one, this is an evasive threat, and even though you're essentially never going to have a full party, technically speaking, you might, and you can do some cool stuff with that. But most importantly, this is a Selfless Savior that protects your entire board. Obviously, you have to lose Linvala just like you have to lose Selfless Savior. However, it protects your entire board. You have this and even just 2 other creatures. It turns the Wrath of God into a 1-for-1 piece of removal, which is fantastic. It also helps protect against targeted removal. So even like, you know, let's say that you're playing in a matchup where you really need a specific piece, right? You really need an Aven Mind Center to stick around, or you really need an Archon of a Myriad to stick around. If your opponent is targeting that one creature, you can say, nah, I'll use this. And this compounds with the other protection, with your Selfless Saviors, with your Ailsids, with your Siren Stormtamers even. So this card is just a fantastic addition to the blue versions, and for what it's worth, it's a legendary creature, and it flies. Those 2 things could matter. We get into 4s today. And I believe this should be relatively short compared to 2 and 3. Ajani Adversary of Tyrants is quite nice. We do have a decent number of 2-drops that we can select from, so the -2 is decent. It does make 2 of your creatures bigger at once, which is quite nice. The emblem you don't, the emblem you don't really have to concern yourself with. The major issue here is the fact that this is a little bit annoying to use because we do play Thalias. And with more and more cards coming in, we have fewer and fewer reasons to play non-creatures at the 4-drop slot. It is still a reasonable choice. Ajani Strength of Pride is not a reasonable choice. Although it does come in with a higher loyalty, gaining life isn't necessarily what we need to be doing in this deck. Making a Pride Mate, also not really what we look to be doing, and we're not going to be gaining a lot of life. I've said across this series so far that there are a bunch of different things that you can do to kind of combine Death and Taxes with an already existing archetype, and I don't see the life gain archetype necessarily being that compatible with the rest of Death and Taxes. Ajani Greathearted seems more similar to the second Ajani than the first, but for me at least, it seems it's more comparable to the first. It's definitely in the middle between those 2. It's in the green splash. What's really nice is that you give all of your creatures vigilance. It's a really nice way to gain life consistently, and you're going to be able to make your creatures larger, which can, as I've already said, help out a lot. The biggest issue, of course, is that there are just other things that you can be playing on for, even in the green splash. Archon of Absolution is like a weird one because it has protection from white, and you're going to be playing a primarily white deck, but this does an okay job of kind of pretending to be better cards. Creatures can't attack your planeswalkers you control unless their controller pays 1 for each of those creatures. If you're going up against a lot of decks that are using relatively go-fast strategies, you could consider this, especially if there are a lot of white weenie decks running around. The issue is that, like, this is kind of not as good of a version as gosh, what is that card? Wind Muse? Yeah, Windborn Muse. This is a 4-mana 2/3, so its stats are flipped, but these stats are better because this can't die to a shock, right? This sticks around a little bit better, and creatures can't attack you unless they pay 2 for each. Obviously, this can this protects your planeswalkers, but we're not necessarily trying to play planeswalkers, so we would very much prefer a Windborn Muse as opposed to this. But if you're really in a meta where there's a bunch of dudes coming at you and your opponents aren't running very many lands, this can help. Archon of Sun's Grace, I've not really utilized this in the Hateful Eidolon version because I tend to have that version have actually a decent number of lower CMCs. Kind of just a glut of low CMCs because that feels better for the deck, because we do end up running more non-creatures, and we still do like to run Thalias. So I haven't really considered this card quite highly. That said, I mean, it's just a 4-mana 3/4 lifelink. If you have these and you don't like have the rares to craft some of the other pieces, I think this is a decent stand-in, and there's potential for this to be in some sort of build. I just haven't created it. Baird, 4-mana 2/4 vigilance, essentially the same text as the Archon, except the Archon flies, and the Archon has like bonus protection. This card is a legendary, which could potentially help it, but in general it hurts it. So it's just Baird is no. Basri's Lieutenant is just generally strong. It works really nicely in those +1/+1 counter decks because this is one of those cards that doesn't inherently necessarily care about 1/1 counters. And you might be saying, "What are you talking about? That's the entire point of this card." Yes and no. It is just a at worst, it's a 4-mana 4/5 with vigilance, protection from multicolored, and a creature to leave behind after a board wipe, and that is absolutely fine. If you include this alongside a few other ways of just incidentally getting value out of your 1/1 counters, then this becomes really annoying for your control opponents to deal with if they're trying to wrath your board or even just single target removal. Additionally, the fact that this has protection from multicolored means that in certain metagames, for example, if we just had Omnath running around constantly, would make this a little bit better. Now, for what it's worth, Omnath is stupid, and you'd probably just lose to them going way over the top on mana, but still, it is a thing. That said, I have made a point to note how competitive the 2 and 3 drop slots are. Those are competitive because of the sheer number of really good, solid cards that go into that slot. 4 is competitive because we typically aren't going to want to run very many 4 drops, and as such, it's essentially just as competitive, even though technically there are fewer total cards, there are fewer total slots. So it might be difficult to slot this in. Cast Out. It has Cycle and it has Flash. Those are 2 great things working for it. I prefer this over things like Conclave Tribunal or Prison Realm, things like that, because of the flexibility this card has. Like, if you just don't need this card, you get to just cycle it. Even though cycling it is, it still is tempo loss because you're paying mana to do essentially nothing. The added utility of being able to flash this in is quite nice, but generally speaking, we now have access to Skyclave Apparition, which is going to be doing most of the heavy lifting. Speaking of Conclave Tribunal, this is fine, right? This is usable because it can become a little bit cheaper when you're tapping out. The issue is, of course, you are tapping your creatures and not attacking in order to remove something that you probably want to attack past. So, Cub Warden. We play a decent number of humans. We play a decent number of non-humans, of course, depending on the build, but we're not really mutating. This card does feel nice, but it is, in my opinion, worse than another card that we're going to be seeing relatively soon. I do like to have cards on 4 that can scale well, and this technically could scale well if we were playing more mutate, and I just don't believe we would. Dusk to Dawn. I'm going to go ahead and do that one. Dusk to Dawn is pretty cool. We can destroy all creatures with power 3 or greater. Very few of our creatures are going to have 3 power to begin with. Obviously, in some of the splashes, there are more likely some creatures. Once we get to the higher CMCs like 4, we're going to have some of that. But still, destroying mostly not our creatures is quite nice, and this helps us in those matchups that are, the big green decks, the big red decks, even like the big black decks. because they play things like Phyrexian Obliterator, for example. Being able to yeet those off the field is quite helpful, while leaving our board essentially spotless. The Aftermath is also quite nice in those specific matchups, essentially large creature / mid-range matchups, because it allows us to get some value over time. One of the main issues is that it doesn't deal with the weenies very well, and the Dawn Half essentially means that this card isn't, because the Dawn Half this is not a typical split card, this is Aftermath, so you have to cast it from your graveyard, does mean that this card, which would be potentially decent against control, is a lot worse, because you have to cast the Dusk Half first, and even if you end up hitting one of their creatures, it's still a very large tempo loss, when you would much rather this just be a better 4-drop, a Planeswalker even, right? So it has its place, but it isn't, in my opinion, in most situations, it's not a main deck card, and in the sideboard, it only comes in very specific matchups, so you need to have a reason to bring it in or put it in the sideboard. Elspeth Sun's Nemesis, I'm underwhelmed with this card. Ever since it came out, honestly, ever since it was previewed, I've been underwhelmed with this card. It can buff your creatures to attack, more of a white weenie effect. It can make some dudes, once again, a white weenie effect, and we don't really need the life gain. What's really nice about this card is that you can have it keep coming back, so if your stuff keeps dying, you're going to be able to get a Planeswalker over and over again, which is relatively nice considering it's just 4 other cards, and not 5 or 6. So it has that going for it, but other than that, she's just not great. Emiel the Blessed is cool and very good in the more ETB-centric decks. You don't have to play this in green, because you can pay, it's hybrid, so you can just pay white for it. You can also just flicker one of your creatures, right? You just get to keep using the ETBs. That paired with the fact that it has a decent body, 4 mana, 4/4, and you have the added ability of, the added utility of getting more bang for your buck, because when the creature enters the battlefield again, you can put a counter on it, makes this a really decent, solid option. I talked in the past about how I want to see, not Blade Displacer. I can't remember. The 3-drop Eldrazi Displacer, there we go. How I wanted Eldrazi Displacer, and some people mentioned Emiel, and I know about Emiel. Emiel's cool. The difference is 1 mana. The fact that Emiel costs 4 and Eldrazi Displacer costs 3 does make a lot of a difference, because it means that you can get Displacer down a turn earlier and start using it a turn earlier. This does come with added benefits. It is a legendary, though, which is a little annoying. Of course, you have to consider the fact that Displacer needs colorless mana, which is potentially more difficult, but, there are pluses and minuses. At the end of the day, this card works really well if you're really trying to get those ETBs. It works really well if you're in the +1/+1 counter version, and it's just fine, right? You can have relatively minimal, flicker effects or whatnot in the deck, or ETBs in the deck, and this is just an okay card, because when your stuff enters the battlefield, you can just make it a little bit bigger. It helps against the flooding, which is one of the issues that faces Death in Texas sometimes. Fate's Fetters is like the Conclave Tribunal type things, except it doesn't actually get rid of the thing, the permanent's still around, it just can't attack, block, or activate its abilities. This does include Planeswalkers, and you get to gain 4 life, but I would rather just get rid of the thing. Gideon's Intervention is kind of strange. If you know what your opponent is trying to do, then you can kind of get them. That said, in most instances, I would prefer to have Ruined Halo, and I even didn't talk very highly of Ruined Halo. For what it's worth, Ruined Halo doesn't stop them from casting the card. So Gideon's Intervention has potentially wider uses there, but they're very similar, and I don't really like both. High Sentinels of Erishin, it has the value in 1/1 counter decks, but it's relatively slow compared to some other things. It competes, in my opinion, quite poorly with Shalai. Shalai has very nice protection that really fits inside the Death in Texas mold, whereas Sentinels just kind of wants you to be in a +1/+1 counter deck. I mean that's pretty much it. Shalai is almost always going to be better than this card. Ixalan's Binding. It's like the others, except your opponents can't like double up and like recast things. It's not great in my opinion. It's nice if your like opponent is playing a bunch of 5-mana Teferis, you get one and they can't cast another one to bounce this, but generally speaking, you know, like that's low-ish percentage considering 60 card deck, yada yada yada. So I tend not to do this. I much prefer Cast Out or even Conclave Tribunal over Binding, because you always have to pay full price for this, and it's the only thing that it can do. Leonid War Leader is the card I was talking about when I was talking about Cub Warden. It's a 4-mana 4/4, which is comparable to Cub Warden. It doesn't have lifelink innately, but what's really nice is that when it attacks, you just get to have these tokens that are attacking with it. And since this is on a 4/4 body, it's not a terrible body, so it can attack in relatively easily. Even if the tokens die just from being blocked, they have lifelink, so you don't worry too much about it. So generally speaking, it's a nice card. Obviously, we would love if Brimaz was in here. I mean, if Brimaz was in here, we'd be freaking going nuts. I own this card. It's 23 bucks. Cool. It's decent, but it competes poorly with things like Shalai, Linvala. Line of Sanctity. You can't be targeted. I mean, you have Hexproof. Discard, if your opponent's playing like mono black discard, this is great. If your opponent's playing a lot of burn, this is great. That's about it. Right now, discard variants are fringy. Mono red is always around, and they often will have burn, but not all of them do. You know, there's goblins decks, there are wizards decks that do run a decent amount of burn. There are red deck wins decks that run a little bit of burn, essentially just like as reach, but are primarily creature decks. So your mileage may vary with Leyline of Sanctity, but it's never like a terrible card in like random metas, just because burn is usually just a decent choice. Linvala, Keeper of Silence. I love this card. 4-mana, 3/4. Activated abilities of creatures your opponent's control can't be activated. So this does count mana abilities. So if you have this out and your opponent uses Nissa to animate one of their lands, excuse me. If your opponent uses Nissa to animate one of their lands, then they can no longer tap that land for mana, which is just hilarious. And because Linvala doesn't see a ton of actual play in Historic, and it's a pretty old card, a lot of people aren't going to know that, which means you're going to get them with it, and they're going to be mad, and maybe they'll frustration concede, which is a real way to win. It does stop other things. Technically, it'll stop like Kethis combo and stuff. It stops, you know, normal mana dorks, land royals, etc., etc. But these are only activated abilities. Triggered abilities still occur. So if you're, you know, dealing with triggered abilities, nothing you can do. Helps against Golos. I'm not going to be able to run through all of the creatures this helps against. Crank up there. There's another card that helps against. So it definitely has its uses, and I really do like this card. Luminous Broodmoth actually got worse with the release of Zendikar Rising, because more creatures came in that were playable that had flying. That said, if you're running relatively few main deck creatures that have flying, Luminous Broodmoth is a good choice, because it allows your creatures to resist board wipes. You kind of see what I'm getting at here with a lot of these 4-drops, is some sort of resistance to just losing the game, right? If you're curving out, if you're going like turn 1 thing, turn 2 thing, turn 3 thing, turn 4 thing, your opponent, turn 4, wrath you, is like the worst thing that can happen. So if you have something like Broodmoth, you say, okay, my Broodmoth is gone, but the rest of my board is still around. Cool. Also, it makes them better because they have flying now. Also, it's just an okay size, right? It's a 4-mana 3/4 with flying. That's totally fine. I do like me some Broodmoth. If you're not running a lot of flyers, this is better. And for what it's worth, if you are running flicker effects, right? So if you're running this alongside Emil, but alongside some other ways of bouncing your creatures, exiling them, and returning them to the battlefield, that'll remove those counters from them, and then they'll be reset for Broodmoth to use them again. So that is something that I did want to mention. Mengar the Diplomat is really cool. I haven't gotten a lot of use out of him, because my opponents just like play around him, which I guess technically does mean I get use out of him, because that means that my control opponents aren't casting things a lot, and my aggro opponents aren't attacking me a lot, so I guess that's reasonable. But it's just, I mean, it's a 4-mana 2/4 that has lifelink innately, and allows you to draw cards if your aggro opponent is aggroing you down, which is hard to do against a 2/4 with lifelink, or your control opponent is just casting 2 spells a turn. What I find often is that my control opponents are just casting like 1 instant speed thing on my turn and then like 1 annoying planeswalker sorcery on their turn, but still a decent option. Ranger of Eos. You can get 2 1-drops, or less I guess, and put them in your hand. Technically, we can be playing and getting Selfless Saviors, Ailsids, a bunch of other 1-drops that we talked about in episode 1. But I question the value of doing that over playing a larger Haymaker. That said, it's a reasonable card. Like you're not gonna really go wrong on a card that literally just says like 4 mana 3/2, draw 2 cards, and like you get to choose which cards they are. So even though they're 1-drops, our 1-drops are essentially primarily protection spells, so they're okay choices. Shalai, the creme de la creme for historic 4-drops. You and your other creatures and your other planeswalkers have hexproof. If your opponent wants to do targeted anything, they have to get rid of Shalai first. And that is fantastic. It completely disrupts their sequencing, completely makes it so that they have to start using resources faster than they otherwise would. And Shalai just has innate Gavany Township, essentially. You're going to be able to just like, oh, you flat out, no problem. You don't have to cast spells anymore. You attack in, your opponent does nothing, pump. Your opponent does nothing, pump. I'm just drawing cards. Oh, you board wipe? Immediately reset the board because I haven't played any lands and I've been flooding. Boom. Shalai is chef's kiss. Fantastic. For what it's worth, you don't even technically have to play her in a green splash. You can play a small number of green sources, even in like a blue splash or something like that, and she's still fine because the primary value here is this, right? This is gravy. This is just like the cherry on top. You do not need this, but when you get it, it's good. Teshar is a combo card. You can be playing a lot of legends, and you have a lot of creatures that cost 3 or less. She has value. I've not gotten a good use out of her because she's a 4-mana 2/2, and 4-mana 2/2s die very easily. The Wanderer, very similar to Teo. She has some cool text here. Prevent all non-combat damage that would be dealt to you and other permanents you control. That essentially means she has to die first against like a burn deck or something like that. And then you get to exile a large creature. She has utility. She's just a non-creature that costs 4 mana, so it's relatively hard to actually get her in the deck. Crook Claw Transmuter. It's another flash card, 4 mana 3/1. When it enters the battlefield, you switch target creature's power and toughness until end of turn. This can just kill things, which is funny. If your opponent has like, let's say, a 2/3 that's attacking into your Thalia, you flash this in, turn their 2/3 into a 3/2, you block with Thalia, their thing dies. If your opponent is playing the wall that pings you for spells, you know what I'm talking about. You can kill that. It just does funny general things. That said, it does cost 4. And it's not always going to do haha funny things, so it's not always going to be worth it. Kasbina. Similar to some of the other planeswalkers we've seen that have these statics. It's very nice. Makes your opponent annoyed to cast your things. You make tokens to loot, which is quite nice in a deck like Death and Taxes, but she gets pushed out by too many things. Sphinx's Foresight is actually quite interesting. Being able to have that really nice early scry, especially if this is game 2 or 3, because you know what your opponent is now up to, means that you can really sculpt a game plan about defeating their game plan. Being able to also scry 1 every turn can mitigate a lot of the issues with Death and Taxes of not only flooding out, but also just, having poor draws. Just like, oh, this is not... I don't need a third Thalia, thank you very much, but I guess I have it. So it's decent. It is a 4-mana 4/4 flyer as well, so its stat line is nothing to scoff at. It's an okay choice, but I've not used it yet because the only Azorius builds I've done so far are the Blink builds. Speaking of the Blink builds, Thassa. We don't have Resto Angel, but we do have Thassa. She just sits around And because she's a creature, on cast, like, you don't have to worry about Thalia being annoying. She just sits there and flickers your things. Do you understand the feeling of joy when you flicker a what is that? I'll not talk about this blue-white card, but when you flicker even just a Charming Prince, when you flicker a meddling mage in order to reset it because you now have more information about what your opponent's playing, when you reset a deputy of attention because your opponent's played something more frightening, and you can just tap a thing. If you flat out, you could just tap a thing. It's gravy. It's nice. For what it's worth, I only ever play 2 because she technically just does nothing most of the time. As a creature, I mean. Ganti, you get to just take something for your opponent. Actual taxation. I will thank you for this. Death Touch is quite nice, but what's really good about Ganti is being able to just turn the tides against your opponent and essentially smack them for trying to play something that's unfair. Kevrik, we have a lot of X1s. If we didn't have a lot of X1s, Kevrik would actually be a decent choice in the sideboard against a lot of low-to-the-ground decks. We have a lot of X1s. You might be able to make a version that doesn't have a lot of X1s, in which case this would be pretty decent in the sideboard, specifically against a bunch of small creatures. As it is, though, we have a bunch of X1s. Leyline of the Void is an interesting way to deal with some of the graveyard shenanigans. It's very similar to Rest in Peace, except it only applies to opponents, but more importantly, it doesn't apply retroactively. So if your opponent already has things in their graveyard, Leyline of the Void coming down isn't going to get rid of those. It's nice that Leyline of the Void can come down for free. Rest in Peace, though, only costs 2. So I've not really seen a situation in which I want Rest in Peace over, or I want Leyline of the Void over Rest in Peace. Liliana, Wicker of the Dead is interesting, and the reason I wanted to talk about this card is because of the fact that I did mention a discard-centric version. I don't think I mentioned Davriel in the 3 CMC one, but meh, it's fine. We aren't, it's a Death and Taxes deck, as I said in some previous videos. It's a Death and Taxes deck first that utilizes some discard elements in order to mess with your opponent's game plan through their hand as opposed to just through their battlefield or through the stack. So that's why this Liliana not actually all that important. I just wanted to kind of point that out. Nightmare Shepherd is black Luminous broodmoth, except what's nice about Nightmare Shepherd is that even if the creature had flying, you can bring it back. And since we typically don't care about the stat line of our creatures, Nightmare Shepherd's drawback of making them 1/1s doesn't really matter. For example, Athalia, we like that she's a 2-mana 2/1 with First Strike, but what we really like is the non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast. So if it becomes just a 1/1 with that good text there, that's fine. Archon, that's fine. Kinjali Sunwing, that's fine. So it's quite nice. Rankle, Master of Prankles. If you're playing like the discard version, this is what you choose over Liliana. This can just have them discard, but can also force them to sack creatures, can draw you cards, which is quite nice, especially considering if you're playing things like Thalia, giving them cards might not necessarily be something that they can even cast. And if you're playing the discard version, for what it's worth, you might, have each player discard a card and draw a card, but you have, a rat in your hand where you play the rat post-combat after they've drawn their card, and they have to get rid of the card anyway. So Rankle's decent if you're going for the discard build. Ravenous Chupacabra, it ETBs and destroys a creature. It's really nice. It's similar to Murder Strider. I've found that I typically use Murder Strider in my black splashes because you get to kill a planeswalker for 1. It's 1 less to cast for 2, and it has lifelink and 1 more point of toughness. That said, Chupacabra benefits from some ETB stuff, but I haven't really done an ETB version in black, or even that uses black, so I don't know if it's worthwhile. Twilight Prophet is really cool, but we are not going to hit the City's Blessing in the majority of games, therefore, not worth. Hellride, take it easy. Hellrider is a card that you play in a deck full of a bunch of small dudes. We technically play small dudes, but we do not play a bunch of them. We're not playing a turn 1, 1-drop, turn 2, 2 1-drops, turn 3, a 1-drop and Cavalcade, turn 4, Hellrider, your opponent's dead. we are trying to play a bit of a longer game. That said, I'm kind of disappointed, like, just an aside, I'm disappointed that, like, Hellrider isn't seeing any play in Historic right now. Like, I'm actually, like, very sad, because Hellrider is super cool. Rekindling Phoenix. This is a card that you absolutely can play in red, because it's just annoying for your opponents to deal with. This is an infinite blocker against aggressive decks. This is an infinite attacker against controlling decks. It's just something that you put it down after you have, you know, destroyed one of your opponent's lands, or made it so that their entire game plan has been shifted by a turn thanks to your Thalias and Friend Wingmares. And now you have a Rekindling Phoenix and they're like, I've used all of my removal already. I don't have the ability to 2-for-1 on myself this Rekindling Phoenix, and I'm just going to get bludgeoned to death with it. That's why I really like Rekindling Phoenix. That said, it's 4-drop, kind of competitive. Tectonic Giant is another card that I've actually really liked in this deck. When it attacks or becomes the target of a spell an opponent controls, you get to either deal 3 damage to your opponent's face, period, like they can't do anything about it, or you get some card choice, right? Some card advantage, essentially. The fact that the second ability allows you to play a land as well means that this card is essentially never going to whiff, because you can at least get a land and go up and mana count to do some other not degenerate things later on. But it's just something where, hey, you want to remove this opponent, you're at least going to give me the option to play a card. For what it's worth, if it's on their turn, you're probably just going to deal 3 damage to them. Because you don't... Oh, it's until the end of your next turn. Never mind, this card is great. Rasta, the Endless Web. When your opponent is playing control and they're playing a lot of... I mean, honestly, even against aggro, if they're playing a lot of burn, this card is just stupid, because it just makes a bunch of annoying creatures. What's nice is that she has 5 toughness, so she's very difficult to deal with for red decks. Yeah, I mean, she's fine. The issue is I've not done a non-ETB version of Green Splash yet, so I don't know if she's really good or if she's just good on paper. Beast Whisper. Whenever you cast a creature, you get to draw a card, which is nice. We are playing a ton of creatures. This is, I guess I haven't said this for some other cards, but notably, this is a 4-drop that is found via Militia Bugler, so that is a point for it. And because it's on cast, your opponent or your creature doesn't have to actually resolve. So if your opponent does counter it, that's kind of fine. That said, it is a 4-mana 2/3, and it's kind of hard to justify the slot. Collecting Company. We play so many 1, 2, and 3 CMC cards. If you're playing green, there's very little reason not to run this card. Technically, it does mean that you have to, like, run a very selected 4-drop. Like, maybe you're running, like, honestly, like 4 of these and, like, 2 Shalais, and then everything else is lands and creatures 1, 2, and 3 CMC. But still, like, the effectiveness of this card cannot be understated. Like, this, for what it's worth, I'm still shocked that they decided to put this in Amkari Mastered, because this card is very strong. Garruk, Unleashed. We don't need it. It's more for, like, a mid-range creature deck that is looking to beat your opponents down with creatures that are large. We're not that, so we don't really need it. Nightpack Ambusher has Flash, which is, like, the only reason I put it on here. Obviously, we're not playing, like, a wolf sub-theme, but it makes wolves by itself. But there's possibly, like, a Bant Flash version of the deck that uses, like, Nibble Obstructionist, uses Aven Mind Sensors, this, Brazen Borrower, some things like that, where, like, on turns 1 and 2, you play, like, actual creatures, and for the rest of the game, you just play a bunch of annoying flash creatures. I don't know if that is, like, viable, at least for right now, but I would not be surprised if I would be able to get some sort of mileage out of that. It really does depend on the number of good flash options that we have access to that still allow us to enact our game plan of just annoying the hell out of our opponent. Nylea makes our creatures cheaper and allows us to get creatures. This is a very similar ability essentially to God damn, some werewolf card that I can't remember the name of right now. It's going to bug me, so I'm actually going to pause. Dusk Watch Recruiter. I literally Google. You can. Oh, you can't see it. I looked for Howl, and yeah, apparently I was right. But yeah, it's very similar. except the difference is this is a 2-mana 2/2 that can actually attack and can become a larger creature, while this is a 4-mana creature. So, Oracle of Moldiah. We're not playing like lands decks, but what's nice is that you do technically get the ability to play additional lands. So this might make the cut in that kind of Night of Autumn, or not Night of Autumn, gosh, Night of the Reliquary build. But I've not made it yet, so I don't know if that is the case. Questing Beast. This is not a Death and Taxes card. Questing Beast is just a strong card. Honestly, if you're splashing green for Death and Taxes, this thing it has keyword soup enough that it's an honorary Death and Taxes card. This is an honorary everything card. You could be playing freaking like Bant Control. No, you can be playing blue-white Control and splash green for Questing Beast, and I wouldn't question it. I mean, I assume you're also like playing Uro before it got like sniped. Oh wait, Uro's still legal in Historic, isn't it? I don't know. I don't care. Questing Beast is a strong card. I'm not going to begrudge you if you play this in a green splash of Death and Taxes. Like that's just how stupid this card is. Ripjaw Raptor is annoying for future decks to deal with because it allows you to keep drawing cards. That said, it fights a contentious spot. Shifting Ceratops is really nice as a sideboard option against blue decks because it can't be countered, it can give itself haste, and it's protection from blue. For what it's worth, protection from blue isn't super valuable because your opponents who are playing blue typically aren't playing like that as removal, but it doesn't mean they can't bounce, they can't block with it with blue creatures. So this does have some nice potential in sideboards of green splashes to just hit your opponents, say like, stop it, I'm gonna kill you. Vizier of the Menagerie. This does allow you to play creature cards from the top of your library. However, it doesn't give them flash or anything like Vivian does, so it's not as good. The body is decent, 4 mana 3/4, but the last ability, being able to spend mana for Ezo or any color, doesn't really matter. Vizier, I think, is just for a different style of deck. Now we get to the multicolored Ariel, Knight of Windgrace. This could be a part of the Knights deck. As I've said, I've not tried the Knights deck, but what is nice about Ariel is the fact that she can just murk things. She gets to make things, sure, that whatever, I don't care. She just gets to murk things, which is quite nice. Aurelia, she's not really a Death and Taxes card, even though like she's really nice. What her abilities do don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. If you're playing the red version, in my opinion, you should be playing Rekindling Phoenix. Basilica Bellhaunt is a fantastic option for the black decks. This gains you life and forces your opponent to discard cards. This is not just good in the discard variants. This is just good generally because it's good against both aggro and control. Gaining 3 life and having a 3/4 body is quite nice. And then, of course, forcing your opponent to discard card and having a 3/4 body is quite nice against control as well. It's a fantastic card. Doom Foretold, we're not playing stacks. We don't have infinite like artifacts or enchantments to play. Stop it. Like, the idea is, like, I've heard of this. I've heard people talk about this card in terms of like Death and Taxes. The idea with this, of course, is it's like taking resources from your opponent. It's symmetrical. We don't have infinite resources. No, stop it. Elenda the Dusk Rose is interesting because of the way I've described some of the other cards here. Luminous Broodmoth, Nightmare Shepherd, things like that. First of all, those cards surpass this easily. But technically speaking, like, the idea is that this also provides board wipe protection, but it doesn't really, because if they all die at once, right, Elenda will have 2 triggers on the stack. Even if you order it such that your whenever the first trigger, essentially the first ability, goes on the stack first, there is no physical permanent right now to put those counters on, so that when the other part resolves, you're not getting those extra tokens. So it doesn't really work the way I wish would, because Elenda has a really awesome animation. Also, she has fantastic art, but she unfortunately isn't as good as Broodmoth or Shepherd. In League Guard Mage, if you're playing the blue splash, play this card. Like, yes, it's only a 4 mana 2/3 flyer, but it gains you 3 life and you draw a card. And you can flicker it in that deck. It's great. Like, I'm not kidding. Like, this card's great. Yeah, no, it's cool. Farland Felidar, we don't have very many creatures with vigilance. Kind of mentioned this with Heedland, whatever. But being able to have your creatures that do have vigilance tap creatures is quite nice. Honestly, if this card were a 2/6, I'd be more inclined to use it, because then one, it doesn't die to Dusk Till Dawn, and it doesn't, and you can get it with Bugler, but as it is, you can't, so I don't like it as much. For what it's worth, it does work really nicely with Ajani Greathearted, but Heroic Reinforcements. This card is really good in specifically aggro decks. We are not specifically that. Like the biggest issue is always going to come back to Thalia. Like, Thalia is going to be a 4 of in almost every single version. There are going to be versions where you don't want that, but in almost every single version, like, the glue that's tying the deck together is Thalia. So, you know, having Thalia out and then seeing this card in your hand and you're like, man, if I didn't have Thalia out, I would just kill my opponent with Heroic Reinforcements. Well, then you probably don't want to be playing this deck. Outlaw's Merriment. This is different. This comes down and is just a constant nuisance against aggro and control. Against control, it's just a bunch of things that are constantly attacking, right? These don't normally get hit by board wipes because you get them on your turn and they have haste. They're not, this isn't a creature, so your opponent, like, especially if this is a game 2 and they haven't seen this, if you side it in, for example, then your opponent probably doesn't have any enchant removal, because all of their stuff becomes creature removal, and you get to just beat them to death. With the, against aggro, these, you don't have to attack with them, right? You could just use them as blockers, and one of them has lifelink, and the other, one of the other ones can deal 1 damage to any target. A lot of things in the aggressive decks are X1s. It's decent, shut up. Raph. He's legendary, he has flash, he makes your other historic spells have flash. I don't know if this is going to go into the, like, the Legends flash thing, deck build thing, bounce thing, but it might. And if it does, cool. Seraph of the Scales, I quite like Seraph of the Scales. She's very similar in my eyes to, Recandling Phoenix, because she has some sort of, resiliency innately. She has Afterlife 2, but Afterlife 2 is not coming back again and again. That said, she does have the ability to have vigilance, so she can attack in the air and stay around for blocking against the aggressive decks, and she has Death Touch, so she can technically trade up. The thing is, around this size, trading up doesn't mean necessarily a ton, and then I'm realizing that Elder Gargoth is a thing, so never mind, I'm gonna shut my damn mouth. Sorin, Vengeful Bloodlord, is really interesting, very similar to the first Ajani we looked at, the first actual card on today's video, because you're able to just get back one of your creatures. It becomes a vampire, but that doesn't really matter. Being able to hit a player or planeswalker and gain life from that is quite nice, and then of course, it's kind of like the other Ajani, the green one, because it allows you to gain a bunch of life with you, this time with your creatures. It's nice, it has its uses, but when I'm playing the black version that's like the resiliency version, I tend to just go with a Nightmare Shepherd. Civics of New Prov. If the ability, if this creature had something else to go for it, I'd like it, right? As it is, it's just a beater that happens to have a nice tax thing a part of it. It, like, remove the vigilance, put something else there, like put some sort of taxing effect there. But yeah, as is, it's unfortunately not what you're looking for. True Fire Captain is funny. It's just not good. Technically speaking, if your opponent is, like, in the weird situation where your opponent is playing like red-white control, I guess, but instead of using real board wipes, they only use like Deafening Clarion and that one Starfield Extinction, Star something Extinction, then I can understand it, but that's not happening anytime soon, so don't. Then we get to Karn. So I've been asked how I feel about the idea of having like a Karn sideboard and or kind of an Eldrazi style Death and Taxes that utilizes these things and like maybe more artifacts or something like that. It's definitely something that you can consider. What's really nice about this Karn, this one specifically, is that it comes like with an innate card advantage. You're going to be able to plus that to kind of get some cards, and then the -1 is some nice card selection, and then the -2 potentially can give you some nice beating. That said, I'm not the biggest fan of this one. When it comes to Karn the Great Creator, though, it has a lot more application in this deck. One, it means that you can have like the Enlightened Tutor sideboard that I was talking about in one of the previous videos, except you don't have to bring those cards in, right? You can, but you don't have to, because you can just have Karn to grab them. And if you, for what it's worth, like, you still have to consider the fact that you're most likely going to still be running Thalia, although for this version you might only be running 3 or 2. There is still a bit of Nambo there, but the fact that you can just grab an artifact, especially even if it's an artifact creature, can be quite nice. And it does have a static ability that just shuts down your opponent's artifacts. And since there are a decent-ish number of decks that are ramping using artifacts right now, you know, using the Forsaken Monument decks as an example, it's not a terrible choice. I've not tried that version, but I'm open to trying a essentially mono white version that happens to run more artifacts and Karn the Great Creator. Solemn ramps, but we don't need ramp. It does draw, but it draws a part of a not great body. Legion Angel, we get to the new cards. I've not gotten a chance to use this yet, as with all of the Zendikar cards, but this seems like a card. I was kind of down on this card initially, but potentially if you have the room for it in your sideboard, which I'm not sure you will, but if you have the room for it in your sideboard, this can just be a nice one-of in the main deck of essentially any of your Death and Taxes decks, but specifically the mono-white version, because it's just an annoying card that your control opponent's going to have to keep dealing with. Unfortunately, this is on ETB, not on cast. Unfortunately, like, you can flicker this in order to get more copies, but if your opponent counters it, then you don't have copies, and if you only run one in the main deck, you're not going to have access to any of those other copies. But what's nice is that if this does resolve, you are going to be able to have another one. And now you just have this 4/3 threat that your opponent knows you have another version, and you can just keep attacking them with this. And even if you want to cast the other one, you can get another one. This feels, for me, very similar to Growth Chamber Guardian, and I really like Growth Chamber Guardian because of that exact line of, I'm going against control, and I don't have to truly commit any new cards, right? I'm not going down on resources other than, I guess, mana to cast these spells, but I'm still applying some nice pressure there. So I like the idea of this card. Whether or not it'll be great in execution, I've yet to test. Hauger Mauling, it can be a land, or it can be a removal spell. I don't know if this is going to be worth the slot in the black version, but it could be. But she is shredded. I made this comment before, that she is shredded, and someone said she's about to be, referencing the fact that there's a giant monster behind her. Leyline Tyrant is interesting. I can't think of anything that you might want to do with this in a Death and Taxes strategy, but there's potentially something I'm missing. So I did want to kind of get out in front of it and say that it's possible that this is a card that you want to look out for future versions of Red and Taxes. If we start doing some like really wonky things, or start seeing some really wonky things come out of Red, because like not losing unspent red mana has potential somewhere. I just can't think of what it is. Nahiri, she's just kind of decent in the artifact equipment version. Sorry. Being able to just like freely equip things is quite nice. She does make tokens, which means she protects herself, which is nice. We don't innately run all that many warriors, and I'm not sure there are a sufficient number of warriors at present to make her -2 spectacular. But you know, it's possible. And then of course, her -3 has potential. It deals damage. It deals twice the number of equipment you control to a creature or planeswalker, so it can be a removal, but like, I don't think it's very good. Like, you have 2 equipment out, it's 4 damage, which sounds like a lot, but it's a -3 on a planeswalker that comes in on 4. So I'm not in love with that, but like, her +1 is probably honestly just good enough in a deck like that. I'm not sure. Obviously, I have to try her out, but eh. I think I finally realized why I think Nahiri looks weird in a lot of her recent depictions. Her head's too wide. A lot of the core have very like narrow heads, and I'm just realizing that looking again at Aura. Yeah. Even Akiri has like a very narrow head. I think that's why I think she looks weird. Huh. Something looked off to me, but I couldn't put my finger on it, but I think it's that. Anyway, Aura, Skycliffe Hierophant, is very interesting. It has lifelink, which is nice. It's a 3/3, For 4, sure, that's fine. It competes with the like the Nightmare Shepherd, the Luminous broodmoth, because what it's trying to do here is have some of that resiliency. The difference is that this one cares about specifically clerics, and I'm pretty sure, like, for Nahiri, I'm not sure how many warriors. I don't think it's very many. For Aura, I'm pretty sure there aren't very many clerics that we want. There may be some clerics in other, like in other cards. Like Containment Priest, I assume might be a cleric. I mean, she's a priest, so I assume she's a cleric. But, you know, something like Giver Runes, that might be a cleric, but we don't have that. So there might be, depending on, like, what types of things Wizards brings in from previous sets, we could see some more cleric support, which means we could get some value out of Aura, but as of right now, not worth a slot. Yasharn, though, Yasharn is worth a slot. This card, on the base, good old 4-mana 4/4, players can't pay life or sacrifice non-land permanents to cast spells or activate abilities. That is amazing. This crushes the sacrifice decks. This makes it so your goblin opponent can't do its skirt prospector things. this means that you're not going to randomly get blown out by a Bolas Citadel. This means that your opponent isn't going to be able to sack their fate. No, they can sack Favorite Passage. They can't sack their Mind Stone to draw a card, right? I can't think of too many pay life scenarios, but they can't do that either, which is fantastic. Like, that alone is quite nice. But she just comes with the ability of just grab a forest and a plains, put those into your hand. That is some mana deck thinning, whatever. Even though, you know, statistically, blah blah blah, whatever. It's still technically deck thinning. It also just means that you get to, you know, you have this. Maybe on your next turn you play Shalai and you hold up Ailsid. And then the turn after that, you play your other land from Yasharn. You now have Shalai mana. So I love the consistency that Yasharn brings. And you might be saying, like, how did you test Yasharn already when you haven't tested a lot of these other ones? Because I made a video recently for Green, White, Death, and Taxes, and Yasharn was in it because she's cool. Me and Construct is interesting the more nonsense is in Historic. Because this, when you kick it, it gets, like, big based on the number of non-basic lands. Obviously, if your opponent is playing, like, mono-green Nissa, that's not going to be very helpful for you. But if your opponent is playing some degenerate nonsense, that's great. And then if it becomes the target of a spell, sacrifice it and create a number, blah, blah, blah. What's interesting is that you can target it with a spell, and you'll get value out of it. But if you just get board wiped, this card doesn't crack into a bunch of mini Hedrons, which I just don't understand. Like, at all. I don't understand why they would do that. It has potential, but, like, it has to be a target of a spell. Like, why? Just make it a dice triggers like everything else. Yeah, it makes me sad. But yeah, this is a shorter video than the previous ones because 4 is limited. Tomorrow we're going to talk about 5s, 6s. I mean, I don't think I've even looked at any 7 drops for what it's worth, but we're going to look at 5s, we're going to look at 6s, and I think we're going to look at lands. So this is going to be Wednesday for you all. So Thursday for you all is going to be 5, 6s, and lands. And then Friday, I guess Friday's going to be deck lists. Yeah, as long as I'm correct. We'll have the rest of the CMCs on Thursday, and Friday will be the deck lists. And I'm not sure how, like, in depth the deck lists are going to be because I have to, like, make all of those decks. They might just be like cores or something like that. But yeah, I think Friday will be deck lists, and depending on how I feel, I might do a video Saturday on my thoughts overall. But in general, I hope you are continuing to enjoy this primer in video form. I'd like to thank my lovely patrons, especially Fogwind, for the continued support. If you'd like to join them and support the show, you'll find links in the description below. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all of that stuff really, really does help me out. And it shows me that you like Death and Taxes, which would mean a lot. Yeah, and until next time, I will be one.